having me over here to speak on the topic of clinical trials. And as Michael has mentioned, I'm a translational physician scientist, so I spend my time between the clinic, the laboratory, and the clinical trials offices. And the paradigm that I try to follow is preclinical investigations of novel agents in CLL and lymphomas, and moving those agents ultimately to the clinical trials based on laboratory discoveries. So we focus on identification of new targets and mechanisms of resistance in the laboratory. And then once the trial starts, we then, of course, with patients' permission and their kind participation, we go back to the laboratory and see if what we see when patients receive the drugs ultimately confirms or correlates, at least partially, with what we have seen in the laboratory. And of course, we are hoping for efficacy in our clinical trials and improvement of quality of life, and ultimately the holy grail in CLL is the cure. We are not there yet, but I think with the current developments, it's really coming to a point where we should start thinking about this very seriously. So let's see. I advance this. So basically, today, what we will talk about is mostly in general terms what clinical trials are, and I'm happy to sort of adjust it based to your needs, because I wasn't 100% sure what you wanted to hear. I do have a bunch of disclosures, but most of them are related to research funding for preclinical work and clinical trials with the molecules that we have been investigating in the laboratory. So I come from the United States. I am from Russia originally, but I have lived and trained in the United States for the past 20 years and practiced medicine there. So the way that drug approvals work in the United States is, it's of course, as you can imagine, it's a very arduous and expensive process. First, the drug needs to be developed in the laboratory, and it's a huge effort in collaboration between chemists, biologists, mathematicians, you name it. And then it goes into preclinical testing, and then the IND application is filed, and finally phase 1 trials are being developed based on the preclinical animal modeling, preclinical testing of the drugs. And those stages from 0 to, I guess, 3 is where mostly I have focused my work in CLL, or our team's work in CLL. And then if a phase 1 study is phased and successful, then this process goes into phase 2 and phase 3 study. And as this process progresses, then more and more people, of course, get involved. The first, and I'm not going to talk about non-therapeutic clinical trials, which are incredibly important too, where we can look at disease mechanisms by just obtaining some of the tissues. But in therapeutic trials, the phase 1 study is typically what first introduces the drug into the clinic. And there can be some first-in-human studies. Usually all the drugs have to go through that. But once the first-of-human, once some idea about the dose is known, then a dedicated phase 1 study in a disease or a group of diseases is undertaken. And typically that would involve fairly few participants, a couple of dozen. There are a few standard dose escalation designs, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated these days as the field of statistics evolves. And the primary question is the treatment actually safe? But also, honestly, in hematology and CLL these days, our bar has grown so high that we anticipate efficacy, very good efficacy in our phase 1 clinical trials, particularly when we talk about combinations. And phase 1 trials often also answer the question of how does the drug interact with food and other medications, et cetera, et cetera. And then if that is successful, phase 2 trials are run. That typically would involve more participants, between 220 and 100. And recently, certain successes have happened including ibrutinib, where some of the drugs have been approved essentially based on phase 1-2 trials. They don't always wait for phase 3 anymore. This is something where FDA has been committing an effort to move novel drugs faster into the clinic. So, but anyway, the phase 2 trials answer the question whether the treatment is effective, more participants. And in relevance to CLL, we watch whether the lymph nodes get smaller and whether there is resolution of bone marrow problems, anemia, thrombocytopenia, and other things. We still monitor whether the drug is safe and what potentially could predict efficacy of the drug. And then in phase 3 studies, that's the one which answers the question whether the new treatment is better than the current standard of care. And there were many phase 3 trials in CLL in the past year that have been reported and resulted in approval of novel agents. So CLL14, venetoclax in frontline management of CLL. And ASCENT, the acalabrutinib trial, the approval is not there yet, but anticipated very soon. But typically, classically, those are the trials which would lead to approval of novel agents once efficacy demonstrated in comparison with some standard of care options, usually chemotherapy or some older novel agent drug. So how do we look at the clinical trial? Typically, what I think about a clinical trial, say, of course, if it's the trial that we have developed in the laboratory, then I'm heavily biased, but say if that bias does not exist, and I'm evaluating a clinical trial which comes from industry or one of my friends, the question, of course, is whether the trial presents a new treatment option and whether it and addresses the unmet medical need. And there's still a lot of unmet medical need in CLL and in lymphomas, as we are still not able to achieve cure in those conditions. And whether there is a good scientific rationale, I think that's particularly important. And running trials which allow us to advance this rationale will actually, I believe, ultimately will save healthcare costs, because there is certainly a lot of trials which are not based on good rationale out there. Is there existing data on efficacy or side effects with the drug? Hopefully, yes. And how typically, there are some practical questions, whether the trial fits our program portfolio, and what is the study population? Will I actually be enroll on the study? Sometimes studies are very restrictive in their eligibility criteria, asking for a lot of things, asking for a lot of testing, and patients often don't like to have like 35 tubes of stuff drawn and million tests done before they can go on a study. So there's actually a lot of logistical questions which goes on to that. And the regulatory team, how much work is there to do for the regulatory team, which actually is there on the ground entering all the data, and it can be actually too much sometimes. So from the patient's perspective, what do patients look when they're looking at the study, and what I recommend they look at? And so I think it's still very important for the patients to be fully involved in the process of a clinical trial, and that's really what informed consent is about. I think it's very important for the patients to know why is the trial being done and be engaged, be part of this whole research process. And what is new about this approach? Why is it exciting? Why it could work better than what we have, what we use as standard of care? One thing you don't want to do, of course, it may be not as relative to CLL, but it's very relevant to some aggressive lymphomas, for example. Does the study have a potential to compromise cure? That's something we certainly don't want. Again, not so relevant to CLL, but many lymphomas, the aggressive lymphomas, there is a good chance of cure. And it's very rare that the study will close up access to standard treatment options. That almost never happens, okay? So in fact, there's been good research showing that participation in a clinical trial, even with an agent which ultimately doesn't work out so well, does not compromise patient survival. There is very good data in breast cancer trials, in fact. And I think for the patients, what's most important, what are the potential side effects of therapy? Typically, when we introduce a trial, when we talk about the trial, we already have an idea what the side effects might be based on data of its similar agents in the class, or maybe earlier first in human studies, et cetera, et cetera. And really that's what impacts patients' lives, and you can't imagine how different everyone is, and every patient cares about very different sets of side effects. You know, it's very difficult to predict who cares for what type of side effects. So it's very important to review all of this. And then, you know, well, how much commitment is it? If in Oregon, it's a big state. I don't know if it's bigger, I think it's bigger than Scotland, but anyway, so we certainly have folks who fly in from distant parts of the state or drive for 6 hours from the coast. And it's kind of difficult to offer a trial which requires 3 times a week visits, you know. So that becomes a logistical issue as well. So when a patient approaches the trial, you know, the patient typically interacts maybe with 2 or 3 people. So there is the principal investigator or the investigator who is involved directly, the physician and the patient. Then there are some other providers whom they might see, the co-investigators on the trial. There are research nurses. At some places also patients end up being involved with clinical research coordinators. Here, other places actually, other institutions, patients don't even see them. But then below the surface, there is all this other stuff that is involved in management of clinical trial and making sure that all the data is good and that everything makes sense. And this is not, by far, not the full list. It's actually ridiculous how many people end up getting involved in a process of starting, running, and closing up a clinical trial. It's really thousands of employees. So it does compare well with an iceberg in that sense. You know, so there are general pros and cons of why participate or not participate in a clinical trial. The pros is that, you know, that really engages the community of patients. It really helps the study participants and other people with this condition and sometimes similar conditions. A lot of trials actually transcend diseases from CLL to mantle cell lymphoma to other lymphomas to even solid tumors. So there is really a huge collective benefit to participation in a clinical trial. You know, and that way the participants really get engaged in the science which stands behind this or that trial. The difficulty is that typically it is more work than just standard of care these days. You know, there are more procedures, lab tests, CTs, filling out a bunch of questionnaires. There is, of course, a risk of always that treatment may not work so well. Well, arguably, we don't always know how the standard of care treatment will work either. So that's often a little bit of a wash. What's most difficult probably is that since those treatments tend to be newer, there may be some new and unexpected adverse events. It happens very rarely, but it does happen once in a while. So hopefully, if everybody agrees, then we come to this sort of collective health, you know, and everyone's happy. Anyway, so there are certain barriers to recruitment on a clinical trial. You know, sometimes living in the US, sometimes you look at the databases and the networks that the European groups have. It's really very commendable how efficiently those systems can work. How the German CLL groups, but you know, in particular, they would be very effective at opening trials at many sites, and then very well organized, and in the UK as well. So there are no planetary databases where patients can go on online and find out what are the trials and how it works. You know, there is this clinicaltrials.gov. It's okay. It feels like, you know, MS-DOS style of a database from late, maybe early 90s. It's not particularly patient-friendly. It doesn't have a great interface. There are individual institutional websites, so unfortunately very few of them are actually really good. Even larger institutions, it's actually very difficult to find what you want. You know, if you live, say, in Kansas, well, I don't want to single out Kansas. Let's say if you live in Portland and you want to find out what trials are there, it's actually not that easy after all. And I still don't understand why that is. We also have, and I personally have been struggling with our website. It's just, I guess it's an investment which most centers still do not prioritize. Patients call and they just say, well, why don't you come and see us? And it would be so nice to have some planetary database where you could go and figure out what you need quickly. Well, so logistics again is certainly a barrier to recruitment, you know, traveling from far, frequent visits. A lot of our patients with CLL are slightly more mature than general population, so they may have trouble getting to the visits on a frequent basis. Then, well, don't get me started on insurance. That is a whole new, you know, because I spend so much time in wet lab science and clinical research, I try not to think about this. Let other people do that and publish their papers in the New York Times. But that's certainly something which is becoming, not getting any easier, let's put it this way. And of course, for many patients, the unknown of a clinical trial is very, very disconcerting, particularly for younger patients. With standard of care options fairly widely available now in the United States, like ibrutinib and venetoclax, it often is easier to go for this than proceed with the clinical trial. I mean, that's a good problem to have, of course, at least in the United States, but I know that in many parts of Europe, it is difficult to get access to those agents. So cost of clinical trials is really a big issue. So my colleague Vinay Prasad, he's at OHSU, he is very outspoken Twitterer. And so he and his group calculated how much it costs to develop an oncology drug. Well, and basically everybody yelled at him very loudly because a lot of people felt that this is a very wild underestimate. So his number came down to $600-700 million. The problem is you never know because really, and that's potentially taken into account drugs which failed, but there was a huge investment into those drugs, right? What's impossible also to calculate how much it takes to bring the drug from the bench, from the chemical tube to the clinic. That could cost a lot of money. Preclinical research is not cheap either. There are really expensive toys there. Patenting, legal fees, that is all a lot of money. So by some estimates, sort of the number that has been circulating around, I'm not sure it's based on that much. Somebody must have said something at one point, so it's $2 billion. By some estimates, that's how much it takes to develop an oncology drug. So $600-700 million is probably the lower end of the estimate. $2 billion is higher end of the estimate. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The cost of clinical trials leading to drug approvals is about $20 million. And so this was, sorry, I didn't put the reference here, but anyway, this was published. The cost in US dollars and millions is actually here on the x-axis. But you see, say, 40 drugs which were approved in the past 10 years, they cost, the trials which led to the approval cost that much. So this is not cheap business. This is a lot of Ferraris and Lamborghinis potentially packed into those clinical trials. And there are a lot of things which goes into increasing the costs of trials. Well, the first thing, of course, is that only 5 to 10% of clinical trials are in general expected to be successful. So basically, a funder, whoever they are, will need to run 20 trials to get to potential approval of one drug, which will then make them some benefit. So that is sort of the hidden cost. there is huge regulatory burden as the governments are getting, well, maybe not larger, but the governments are certainly, and that a lot of this is a good thing compared with the 50s and 60s, where a lot of this has not been well regulated and pretty freewheeling attitude towards things like that. But these days, there is so much documentation which needs to happen, and that all ensures safety in the end. So the trials have certainly become significantly safer compared to what was happening, say, 40, 50 years ago. It's still possible, but it's much more difficult to do something completely wrong because of the amount of oversight that happens. And investigators have a lot of role. Ultimately, I write my clinical trials, but even when I write my trial, and then 3 years, finally it begins, we enroll a couple of patients, and then I want to do something, and I email my team and say, so why don't we do this? There will be 5 people who would say, no, you cannot do this. The research nurses, the data managers, the clinical research coordinators, because you wrote in this protocol exactly that. So you cannot do what you want. So there is a lot of oversight, essentially on a daily basis, and that's good. I don't want to screw up my own trial, you know. So that kind of oversight ensures safety of the patients. I can't just do what, you know, some random things. Not like 60, 70 years ago, and, you know, there were a lot of bad press about certain egregious events that happened all over the world in terms of clinical research. So trials are getting big. You know, particularly as our treatments are getting better, there are more non-inferiority trials are run. Non-inferiority trials are looking to prove that one treatment is no worse than another. That requires huge statistical effort and larger population of patients. Delays in recruitment are also a problem. You know, 80% of trials fail to finish on time. And I think another issue is that available standard of care options with low efficacy, particularly that's not so relevant to CLL, but in solid tumor oncology, where there are approvals coming one after another with 2-week benefit in survival, potentially that ultimately prevents patients going on a clinical trial, which becomes a really effective option. So, you know, I don't necessarily have good answers how to solve all of this problem. I think it would be a great idea to have some planetary, maybe even galactic databases so that we would know, like even now, if I want to find a good trial for some of my patients when we don't have it in Portland, I have to personally email all of my friends and say, hey, you do have something. I would like to see something better than this.
Sorry, you have just 2 minutes.
Yep. There are limited healthcare resources, of course, and I think we do run maybe too many trials. Again, that's particularly in oncology. Not all of them are well based on biologic rationale. So that's, you know, one editorial which was written, 166,000 patient slots just for PD-1. You know, do we even have that many patients, right? And, you know, as we have electronic medical records, it would be really nice to have some, again, centralized, to use it as a centralized resource where you could learn a lot about what happens with this drug or that drug. So, I talked a little bit about this, and I don't think actually a lot of this is that relevant to CLL, but I actually would like to introduce a 50% down rule. I would call it the Danilov 50% down rule, and that's particularly relevant to novel BTK inhibitors. If you come out with, there is one BTK inhibitor approved in CLL, ibrutinib, and I think that each subsequent one should cost 50% of the original. And that way, if we have 4, we go to 25%, well, to 12.5% of the original price, and that would be really good competition, because it's really annoying to see when new agents come up and they say they're equivalent and somehow they cost more. I think that's really not great. Anyway, I do think that there is exciting stuff happening in clinical trials. There are problems, of course, but overall I think we can solve them, and I would certainly encourage participation in clinical trials because that's what moves the needle for the field. Thank you very much.